Minister, ladies and gentlemen, the Paterson Oration was established in honour of the late John Paterson, and I'd like to welcome his widow Mary, who is with us today. We have previously had John Howard and Helen Clark to deliver this lecture, and now we are delighted that the Honourable Kevin Rudd, MP, the 26th Prime Minister of Australia, and already a good supporter of this school, has been available to deliver this lecture. We're especially delighted that Mr Rudd is a Prime Minister who arrived in government with a very deep knowledge and experience of public management and government reform at all levels of government in Australia. So thank you very much, Prime Minister. We look forward to your oration.
Thanks very much, Alan. To Mary Paterson, you are an honoured guest among us, and we honour, of course, John. Gareth Evans, former Foreign Minister of Australia, and one of Australia's most distinguished representatives abroad. Pacific Island Executive Program PACE delegates who are here with us today, our friends from across the Pacific, I extend you personal and warm greetings, having met recently with your heads of government in Cairns. Secretaries and member of the SES and the Australian Public Service, faculty and staff of ANSOG, distinguished guests one and all. It's good to have Gareth with us. I remember when Gareth, about a decade or so ago, introduced me at a conference which we were both attending in Malaysia. And his job was to introduce me and said that Kevin had begun life as a diplomat. He had then gone on to become a state bureaucrat and was now a candidate for the House of Representatives. And then he added, in inimitable Gareth fashion, he said, most of us, Kevin, choose to work our way up the totem pole in life rather than to slide down the totem pole in life, as you seem to have done with your career. Thank you, Gareth. Not that of course, I have forgotten those observations 10 years ago. I come to you, of course, as someone who has worked previously as a public servant, both at the federal level and at the state level. I'm not sure that my father would have entirely approved. He was a farmer, a genuine man of the soil. And though I was too young to remember this, one of my older brothers reminds me that he had views on this subject of bureaucrats, as he described them. Now, he said to my oldest brother once that bureaucracy, he said in his view, was the world's second oldest profession, but considerably less entertaining and useful than the world's oldest profession. That was his views. I couldn't possibly comment. I am mindful also of other folk that you may have worked with over the years as well. Mike Codd, who was former head of the Prime Minister's Department. Mike was the chairman of the Secretary of PM&C when the Council of Australian Governments process was just getting going about 20 years ago, in the late 80s, early 90s. And I remember him chairing the first meeting, I think, of officials between the Commonwealth and the States. At that stage, I'd actually walked across the Mason-Dixon line. I was working for the States, having previously worked for the Commonwealth. And then there was one huge policy brawl, as I'm sure occasionally occurs, between federal and state bureaucrats in meetings. And Mike Codd leant across the table, as I was then representing the Queensland government delegation of officials, and said, the great thing about you, Kevin, is that once upon a time you worked for the Department of Foreign Affairs, now you work for the state government of Queensland. In both cases, you have never worked for the national interest. So, anyone here from DFAT? Yeah. And yeah, we often cop these things. Speaking of DFAT, though, remember when the department merged back in 1987, the former Department of Foreign Affairs with the then Department of Trade? I always remember one of the great old harumphers of DFA, as it was in those days, who shall remain nameless, who once in a senior executive meeting, which I didn't attend as a representative because I wasn't one, I think I was getting the tea or taking the notes, who leant across the table and said, of the proposed merger with the Department of Trade, I thought we employed these chaps to press our trousers, not to wear them. So, anyway, I'm sure that culture is gone as well. It's a fun old business, isn't it, the Australian Public Service? Can I begin by acknowledging the first Australians on whose land we meet and whose cultures we celebrate as the oldest continuing cultures in human history. It's an honour to be delivering the third John Paterson oration, following on from the previous addressees by former Prime Minister John Howard and Helen Clark of New Zealand. While the Australian and New Zealand School of Government is still in its early years, it is already building a tradition of helping to shape the next generation of public service leaders on both sides of the Tasman. One of the important traditions it is creating is this oration, an excellent occasion to advance public debate about future directions of public administration and the public service more broadly. The oration is named after John Paterson, a great leader and a great reformer, a man who in particular led the way in reform of community services, health and infrastructure in both New South Wales and Victoria. John was no Sir Humphrey Appleby. He earned a reputation as a restless intellect, a person of great compassion, and yet a very tough-minded reformer. He once said that more could be learned about organisational change from the literature on Revolutionary War than from the teaching of business schools. In fact, Paterson said that in the battle to change institutions, and I quote him, quote, "Peace only becomes possible when you have captured all the territory, re-educated all the prisoners who are willing to become loyal citizens, and put to the sword those who remain unreconstructed." Unquote. John Paterson displayed what could be described as a firm approach to public sector management. I'm sure none of you have embarked upon a similar tradition, least of all the Secretary of my own department. John Paterson clearly encountered some obstacles in reforming the Regional Water Board of the Hunter Valley in New South Wales, but he also showed a capacity to see the challenges he faced in a much wider context. The task of public service reform confronting leaders like John Paterson in the 1980s was to modernise large, powerful and sclerotic public sector organisations. In the simplest terms, the task was to make the public service genuinely serve the interests of the wider economy and society after decades in which many government agencies had become increasingly managed for the purposes of serving themselves. Today's challenges are not the same as those John Paterson faced, but they are equally important, broad in scope, deep in complexity, and confronting us at a time when new global, national and local forces of change are blowing across the shores of Australian public administration. These are challenges that will require a new generation of public service leadership, a new standard of public service excellence, and therefore a new era of public service reform. The government I lead came to office pledging to reinvigorate the Westminster tradition of merit-based, independent public service, committed to the highest quality policy making. We chose the word reinvigorate carefully. We did not say reinvent, because the APS is a strong, professional public service that has served successive governments very well. The professionalism of the public service has been evident since the first day after the 2007 election, when I received the first handover briefings from Dr. Peter Shergold and other senior departmental secretaries. The quality of that briefing and the work of public servants to ensure a seamless transition to government in the following weeks and months was testimony not only to the competence of the public service, but to the value it placed on continuity. And I note that my predecessor, Mr. Howard, made the same point when delivering the Garran oration in 1997, and I quote him, that power can be transferred in this calm, understated way is a supreme asset. This is truly one of the most remarkable features of the Westminster tradition, and is one we should not merely take for granted. Its success is in part the result of the sweeping reforms to the public service a century and a half ago, in another era and another place, through the Northcote-Trevelyan Report in Britain in 1854. That report not only created the modern British civil service, but laid the foundations of the ethos of the APS almost a century later. At the time, Britain was undergoing major economic changes in the wake of industrialisation. The empire was expanding, people were on the move, and Europe was alive with revolutionary fervour. And the British civil service was riven with patronage, incompetence and corruption. The recommendations of the Northcote-Trevelyan Report, a response to crisis in its time, helped create a civil service that was independent, impartial, recruited by competitive examination and promoted on the basis of merit. In time, its impact stretched to the Australian colonies, where both Victoria and Queensland sought to limit political patronage by introducing competitive entry exams into their public services. And it profoundly shaped the culture of the Australian public service after its formation in 1901. But Australia never simply copied the British model. The APS never created the class structure in the same way the British Civil Service did, with Sir Humphrey's Oxbridge-educated administrator class unfailingly at the top. Instead, some of Australia's leading public servants have been the children of builders, bootmakers, railway station masters and refugees. One of the wonderful things about Australia. Or they left school at the age of 15 to be telegraph messengers and bank clerks. What counted was not their modest beginnings, but their fitness for the job. Take Sir Ronald Wilson, our longest-serving Treasury Secretary, the son of a West Coast Tasmanian builder. Or another former Treasury Chief, Sir Richard Randall, who worked for 8 years as a wool classer. Or another, Ted Evans, who worked for 10 years in his early life as a PMG linesman. And given that his replacement, current Treasury Secretary Ken Henry, is the son of a New South Wales timber worker, my father for a period was a Queensland timber getter, it is clear that the APS principle of promoting merit over privilege is alive and well. And there is a second lesson from history that particularly resonates today. As I said before, the periods of most active public service reform have been periods of rapid change and even upheaval in the wider society. Times when change has forced the public service to develop new structures and skills and find talented new people. In the 1940s, the all-out war effort, followed by the huge post-war nation-building program, created a generational change in the Australian public service. For the first time, there was an influx of brilliant outsiders to manage great wartime enterprises, to staff the departments of Treasury and post-war reconstruction, and to establish the new Foreign Service. At the time, the public service was a closed shop. The idea of outsiders joining was intensely controversial. So much so that when the economist Roland Wilson, with doctorates from both Oxford and Chicago, was recruited to the Bureau of Census and Statistics as the first government economics advisor in 1932, the staff of the Bureau went on strike. Any ABS people here? Just bear that in mind. The new public servants laid the foundations for decades of post-war prosperity and better living standards for Australians. They're among the first in the world to see and seize the opportunities of Keynesian economics as an active economic and social role for the post-war democratic state. They managed the government's commitment to full employment and the development of a modern social security system, to a large immigration program, to enormous infrastructure projects such as the Snowy Mountains scheme, and to the beginnings of our National University scheme. In other words, they were nation builders within their own public service tradition, with a sense that the words "prosper the Commonwealth" were etched deep in their intellect, their imagination, and their sense of duty to the nation. Nugget Coombs, a railway station master's son, is perhaps the best known of them, a man who earned his place in any catalogue in the greatest Australians in our nation's story. In his appointment to head the Department of Post-War Reconstruction, he was given an explicit brief to promote a much more activist role for the state. And it was Nugget Coombs who a generation later chaired the famous Royal Commission into Australian Government Administration in 1974. Nugget's broad vision for the role of the public service was reflected in his remark after releasing his report that in the modern world, the bureaucracy, and I quote him, is not an island entire unto itself, but a living part of Australian society, reflecting the strengths and weaknesses of that society. The Coombs Royal Commission came at another turning point for Australian society and Australian history. The long post-war boom, in large part made possible by the reforms of the 1940s, created huge national wealth, but also in a time of a culture of self-satisfaction, complacency and rigidity in the public service, in the broader economy, and to some extent in society at large. Public service structures created 30 years earlier struggled to cope with a time of profound economic and social change. The Coombs Commission identified themes that have shaped the development of the APS ever since. It argued that the public service had to become more responsive to the democratically elected government of the day,